It is a pleasure for me to be with you tonight. Just one other thing that wasn't on that bio was I actually had the great privilege this semester of teaching HR data analytics to a group of Masters in Human Resources students. I imagine none of you were in that class, so that's a good thing, actually, probably. It was a fairly intensive class, I think. So, but I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed working with the students, and it's been great. And I have a great respect for all of you and going through an MBA program and dedicating your time and energy to that. It's not an easy thing to get through, and I guess the thing I would say is, and I'll talk a little bit more about my experience at IBM as I'm kind of talking tonight, but um, you know, when you go through your career, I always had in my mind, like when I started college, I had in my mind that I would, I'd start at point A and then I'd go to a company and I would, I'd get promoted and I'd kind of go to A to B to C to D, and it would be this sort of straight line trajectory in terms of my career path. And what I found was, instead of being this sort of straight line trajectory, it was much more like a cow path. So if you've ever seen a cow in a pasture, they just kind of wander around, right? They go from place to place, and they go from clump of grass to clump of grass, and maybe over to the pond and get some water, and then they stand in the shade for a while, and then they go back out and they eat. Yeah, my career has been more kind of like that. And most of the people I know, their career has been more like that. Um, it's been kind of wandering around and going from opportunity to opportunity and kind of seeing what's out there. So, I guess one of the things I'd say is and many of you have already been in a job, much like I was in a job before I went back and got my MBA. And so, sort of keep yourself open to that. Keep yourself open to the opportunities. I think, one of the best things I did career-wise was being willing to relocate, being willing to kind of go to other places and see other parts of the business and be open to that. What that eventually led to is ability to work in a job that I love from my own office in my own home. I totally eliminated my commute. Well, it's 10 feet, from the kitchen into my office. But, it's been great. And that just started. That's just where I sort of recently arrived at. And so, I just say, give yourself that opportunity. Give yourself the option of exploring those kinds of things a bit. Okay, so let's see. Let's talk about negotiation. So here's the thing I think that's really cool about going to a negotiation class. You're learning a skill right now that most people abhor. They hate doing negotiations. If you don't believe that, just think about how many car companies now say, we listen, right? You can come in and we'll give you a price on a car and you don't have to negotiate it. We'll get you in here and out of here in an hour, right? Why is that? Because people hate going in and negotiating a price on a car, most people. If you can learn that skill, you'll be able to do something that most people hate doing, and people will pay you for that. So this is a key class. When I took a negotiation class in my MBA course of study, it was a very emotional class, and the teacher made it that way on purpose. And we learned a lot, and I remember a lot from that class. Not necessarily a lot about negotiation, however. So let me talk a little bit about some things. One of the things that Dr. Wynn asked me to talk about was to kind of leave you with three kind of tips or points that I sort of pulled from negotiation. And so I'm going to do that, and I was going to do it at the end, but I think I'll just do it as I talk to you, and then I'll give you some examples. The first thing that I would say is you need to know yourself. The first thing you need to do as a negotiator is to know yourself. You need to know who you are. You need to know what your triggers are. You need to know what makes you mad. You need to know what makes you happy. You need to know what makes you anxious. You need to know what your position is. You need to know how low you can go. You need to know all those kinds of things about yourself and your position. You need to think about what's the worst possible thing that could come from this negotiation. Like, if I blow it, am I going to get fired? That, you have to know what those limits are. How low can you go in terms of what you can accept, and how high can you go in terms of what you can demand? And I think that, so it's really important to kind of know that. What are the things you must have out of the negotiation? and what are some things that you can give up. So I think, that's sort of the first point I would say. And I think a thing that does for you is it provides for you to come from a place of confidence. So being in a position of confidence as opposed to one of anxiety will almost certainly yield a better income and a better outcome. So, and there's some studies that were done at Harvard that they talked about emotion and negotiation, and that was one of the outcomes of that study was that, if you can sort of take the anxiety out of it and the nervousness out of it, then he's got the article. Oh, yeah, okay, that's it. Yeah. So if you can do that, then you're likely to be more successful. And I think the way you get that confidence is to know your positions, your boundaries, your outcome, the worst that could happen, and also kind of the best that could happen. I mean, what do you really hope for? What do you hope to get out of this? All right. So I think that's the first point I would say. One of the things that I'm doing right now is I'm working with the HR Business Development Organization. So what is HR Business Development? Most of my career has been in human resources. When I was SVP at Mountain America, I was the head of human resources there. And so what we're looking at is we go into a merger or an acquisition, or a divestiture is also part of what we do. And we also do some outsourcing. So what outsourcing isn't us outsourcing to other people. It's us taking in the outsourcing from those companies. So we call it outsourcing, but it's really sort of insourcing. We're really taking over, IBM is taking over some of the functions of another business. And so we're bringing usually assets as well as people on board. And so my job really has to do with kind of how do we do that? How do we get people to transition into IBM from either an acquisition that's occurred or from the outsourcing that's happening? And you can imagine, people have different sort of emotions going into IBM. Sometimes they're very fearful that, this is a big company. I think IBM right now is about 370,000 employees worldwide, so it's a pretty big company. Somebody was asking about job opportunities at IBM. We probably have in the U.S. right now about 4,000 open positions. So, if you're interested in getting a job, please go out and apply. Do my little rah-rah for IBM and come and join us. But so that size of company can be intimidating to some people. Are they going to come in and tell me what to do? Are they going to fire me? Are they going to lay me off? Am I going to be without a job? Or am I going to get treated poorly? Am I going to have good benefits or bad benefits? And what's going to, so all these questions are going through people's minds. And so one of the things we try and do is trying to allay those fears a bit and help them get comfortable with what they're getting into, and also kind of what we stand for and what our values are. And as I looked at rejoining IBM, one of the things that I loved about working at IBM before was that it had very consistent values and ones that people understood very well and that were promulgated within the company and were talked about frequently, and that is still the case. By the way, those values have evolved since I was there. I was gone for about 17 years. I was gone for a while, and it's a very different company than the one I left. When I left IBM, they had some pretty major manufacturing sites around the U.S. They have no manufacturing in the U.S. anymore. They very much transformed the business into being a lot around services and consulting and those kinds of things. Obviously, still have some hardware, some software, and those kinds of things besides services, but things are moving to the cloud. You've probably heard of cognitive computing and data analytics, and they've moved into that space as well. So, and data security is also a big part of the business now. So very much they've transformed, and they're in the process of transforming again. You may have heard of Watson, and it was the computer that played Jeopardy and won, and they kind of were able to do that. They've taken that cognitive computing that Watson embodied and moved that into a healthcare space. And so essentially what that does is it helps doctors who are so behind usually in getting the current information, the current research on diagnoses and those kinds of things. really helps them try to do a better job of diagnosis. So the doctor can kind of do the bedside manner piece and can rely on millions and millions of data inputs to help them do an accurate diagnosis. Very exciting stuff. So anyway, that's a little bit about what I do. So first position I would say is get comfortable with where you are and where you're coming from. And that's one of the things we try and do when we're doing an acquisition, is we try and allay people's fears about where we're coming from. Second thing I would say is to try and know your enemy. So I say that in that way to make a point. Usually we're not negotiating with an enemy, are we? We're really negotiating with someone that we want to develop a relationship with. And the old saying is, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And I think that it's really important as you're going into a negotiation to know the other side and to know about them as much as you can. So how do you do that? And I think one of the ways you can do that certainly is you can Facebook stalk people. And you can LinkedIn stalk people, right? So you can go out and find as much information as you can publicly about them. But that's kind of gives you a cursory view of what they're doing, and you can get some good data that way. I think one of the important things to do is to just ask questions. I think one of the most important things you can do in a negotiation is get to know the other side. There was also an experiment that was done between Stanford and Northwestern, I think were the two universities, and they did an email negotiation. And in the email negotiation, they had in certain instructions, one side was to just do very businesslike, right? Just get to the point of the negotiation and, back and forth and come to some conclusion. And the other one was to see how much schmoozing they could do between the two parties. And the ones that schmoozed were about 50% successful, 57% successful. The ones that didn't were about 40% successful. So you can increase your ability to arrive at a successful negotiation if you just kind of get to know the people. So I want to give you a formula that I think is really helpful for this. And so this is how the formula goes. So if you're taking notes, you can write this down. So trust. So my willingness to trust you equals competency, right? So how good do I think you are at things? By the way, it goes the other way, right? So if you can sort of exude this confidence and this competency, then you're likely to engender more trust with the person that you're negotiating with. Okay? So trust equals competency plus reliability. Do you do what you say you're going to do? When you set a meeting with me to negotiate, do you come? Do you show up on the phone? Are you there and ready to go? Do you go, if you said, hey, I'll go find out about something, have you gone and found out about it before the next time you meet? So your reliability, so competency plus reliability plus intimacy. How well do you know each other? How well do you know the person you're negotiating with? So it kind of gets to that schmoozing part, right? Do I know about this person's personal life? Do I know about their dreams and aspirations? Do I know about what they're trying to do? In the mergers and acquisitions space, do we understand? We talk with the CEOs, and usually the CEOs' most sort of intimate direct reports. Do we understand what their aspirations are, what they're trying to do with the business that they've built, and what they want to see for that business in the future? So it isn't just about, we're going to pay you this much, we're going to take your stock options, we'll convert them, you'll get this much of a spread, and that's how much money you're going to get, and boom, you're done. It isn't about that. It's really about trying to understand, because generally speaking, if we're going to have those people come on board, because a lot of this is about intellectual capital, right? We want that intellectual capital to come too. The stuff that's inside people's heads, we want that to come too. And so if we want that, then we need to kind of understand what motivates them and what they're trying to accomplish and what sort of gets them up in the morning and also what keeps them up at night, right? So try and understand all of those things. Okay, so trust equals competency plus reliability plus intimacy. And then all of that over what I believe your self-orientation is. Like, what are you in it for? And that kind of gets back to the schmoozing thing too. What do I think you're trying to accomplish? So that can be a negative, right? It can be, what do I think you're trying to get out of me? What do I think you're trying to pull over on me? But it's also an opportunity, if that is positive, to generate additional trust. So the formula is trust equals competency plus reliability plus intimacy over self-orientation. Okay, so the last pointer I would give, how am I doing time-wise? Okay, I'm good. The last pointer I would give you in terms of tonight is to try and keep all the options on the table. Sometimes we negotiate serially, right? So we'll do this, and then we'll do this, and then we'll do this. And what tends to be more effective and tends to drive win-win situations more is if we can talk about, we want to sort of come to conclusion on these 5 things. And so let's kind of talk about that. And I heard you use the term anchor. And so that's a really good thing. So let me talk about that a little bit. So recently involved in a negotiation with an acquisition that we were doing and talking to the CEO. And we're going to I mentioned retaining that intellectual capital. We're going to pay them a certain amount of money to stay with the business while we go through transition at least. We'd love to have them stay even longer, but we need them to stay at least for a couple of years. And so what we do is we come up with a dollar amount that will allow them to do that. Now understand, when you're an entrepreneur and you've started a business and you've been building that business and it's been your baby and you're kind of the face to the customer and all those things, that you've set up stock options. Usually the board has set up stock options for you, even if it's a privately held company. That are, for most of these guys, they're walking away with some pretty good money. And so what we don't want them to do is just take the money and run. We would like them to stay. So we've got to come up with a dollar amount that will entice them to stay and still make it viable as a business, right? Because we have a budget that we have to stay within too. And the business case is driven by that budget to say we're going to pay this much. We're going to look for this kind of a return from it. We expect this kind of growth. We see their numbers and go through due diligence and look at what their growth projections are and their sales projections and their revenue projections, all of those things. So we want to have all of that happen. And so we do this negotiations. And we recently I wanted to talk about this deal we did recently because we're talking with the CEO, and we kind of talk through his people first. And that's typically what we would do, right? We'd say, try and level set. Here's kind of what we think we would do. Here are the things we looked at. We look at how much money is in their vested options, how much is in unvested options. By the way, the unvested options we turn into IBM options, and then they have those going forward. Those unvested options are what we call holding power. So how much is there on the table for them if they stick around versus how much do they already have that's vested that they're going to get immediately upon changing control. As soon as the business is signed over to IBM, they get the money. Boom. So big chunk. So we kind of walked through his folks and get a couple of inputs, and there were a couple of people that he thought we probably ought to go a little higher on, and we were prepared to do that. We anchored a little low, right? So we could kind of come in and say, this is what we kind of expect to spend. And we try to paint the picture for him, like the more we spend on these, what we call tier 1 folks, the less we're going to have for the tier 2 folks. And so if you're going to stay around and you want it to be successful, and you've got some good folks underneath in the development organization, then, and we want to keep those, then the more we spend up here, the less we're going to have for down here. So we try and paint that picture for them so they can, make wise business choices as they're looking at their direct reports and themselves. So we put a number out there for his retention, and he kind of hemmed and hawed and kind of said, well, I was sort of expecting it to be, a couple of decimal points higher. And so we said, well, that seems really high. Why were you expecting that? So just ask some questions, right? And he said, well, I talked to some other CEOs of some acquisitions that have happened, and that's kind of what they were getting. And we said, well, here's what we're offering to you. And we kind of went through, that. So we're doing this negotiation back and forth, right? But his level of confidence in asking for that was really interesting because I got the sense, and he also stated, I don't want to appear greedy, but I also want to get what's fair in terms of the market. Well, the market when you start looking at acquisitions, is all over the board, right? Because there's so many aspects of this negotiation that go on. There's the vested options. There's the unvested options. There's the salary that they're going to get after. There's bonus opportunity they're going to get after. There's a lot more security, for example. Like IBM's not going to go under tomorrow, which their company, if they didn't have ongoing sales and funding, they had, so to understand this business, they had 20 customers. That's how many total customers they had. That's not a lot. You lose 2 customers, you've now lost 10% of your business. If those 2 customers happen to be your 2 biggest customers, you've lost 75% of your business. So, that's a very risky sort of place to be in the marketplace. So what we're offering is a lot more stability. So we try to talk about that a little bit. And so we offered more, but not everything that he was asking for, and he accepted that. And so we were able to come to a conclusion on that because we were confident in our ability. He was not as confident in what he was asking for, right? So he came from a position of a bit of a position of weakness, if I was going to say it that way, and we were able to negotiate what we felt was the right amount, still higher than we'd started out, but the right amount, and still within budget, so that we have sufficient to now go out and touch the tier 2 people that we need to touch. Okay, so that's one side. So on one side of it, we're doing negotiations with the companies that we're acquiring. The other side of it is, I mentioned the tier 2 budget. When we went in, the business unit, so the business unit is the part of the business that's purchasing that particular organization. The business unit had a budget that they put together for retention. We started looking at what the holding power was going to be, that is the unvested options, and we looked at what the salaries had been and what we were going to need to do to sort of get salaries in line with market, because they've been paying a little under market, and they'd also been having quite a bit of attrition because of that. We went back to the business and said, we don't think we're going to have enough money to do the right level of retention. And there was some pushback there. So we're negotiating with the folks in the business that we're acquiring, and we're negotiating internally with the business unit to say, we need more budget. Because we think in order to be successful in retaining the skills that you need for this business to be an ongoing entity, you're going to have to reach deeper in the organization. So we were successful in doing that. We increased the budget by 25%. So that was pretty good, right? We felt pretty good about that. We didn't get everything we asked for, but we got more than we had. So again, I would say, and kind of going back to the negotiation with the CEO, keep all the options on the table, right? Because we have other things we're talking about besides his retention money. We're talking about his salary. We're talking about his bonus. We're talking about whether or not he leads the new organization that we're going to build with this. So his position within the company. We're talking about his future opportunities. We're talking about all those things. So we try and put all of that on the table, not just say, okay, we're going to talk about retention dollars, and don't worry about how much we're going to pay, and don't worry about the bonus that you'll get, and don't worry about what you're going to be titled and where your level's going to be and all those things. And he'd also done some homework, right? He came back and said, well, I understand that banding is a big deal, and I kind of wondered what band I was going to be, and because we have 4 different bands of executives. Yeah, 4 different bands of executives. And so he said, I understand that's a big deal within IBM. And so we talked through that, and we sort of reassured him that we would do the right thing in terms of whatever his level of responsibility would be commensurate with what band we give him. So, I think it's really important to kind of do that. The last thing I would say in terms of sort of keeping the options on the table is, and I mentioned this about anxiety and sort of that emotion, anxiety, fear, nervousness going in. I think the other side of it is sometimes the temptation is to go in with kind of an angry approach to negotiation. And again, it sort of depends on the type of negotiation. If it's a one-time deal where you're never going to see the person again, you might be able to drive a better deal if you come across with anger. But generally speaking, those aren't the kinds of negotiations we're involved with. It's not the kind of negotiation I've been involved with in my job almost never, right? It's always about developing and sustaining a long-term relationship. And that's especially true when we're doing these acquisitions, where we want those people to come on board, be happy, be productive, drive that business to success, use the resources that we can help provide them to do that. So it's really important, I think, to kind of keep anger in check. So if we had reacted angrily or sort of disgustedly, maybe, in a negative way to this CEO's request for a lot more money, could have that soured the relationship? Would have he felt bad about, asking, or, yeah, all those things could have happened. And understand that this isn't finalized yet. It's still going through a lot of iterations of back and forth until it gets signed. We did find out that it was approved internally so we do an initial concept. We go out and do due diligence, and we spend about a week with the company in a hotel someplace, going through due diligence and looking at all the aspects of their business, looking at the risks and assessing those risks, and figuring out and trying to put a dollar amount on what those risks are, which is a fun exercise all by itself. And then go back and report to the senior vice presidents at IBM on what we found in due diligence and whether we recommend going forward with the acquisition. And in this case, we did recommend that, and it was approved today. So yay. Now we're looking at working towards signing on December the 1st, which is the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, which means my Thanksgiving will probably be a meal and then back to work. But that's okay, right? So that's the nature of the beast when you're in mergers and acquisitions. It's very, very time-driven. I heard a couple of people saying, wow, I wish we had more time to do these. Yeah, you won't have time. You just never will have enough time. This is a great exercise in saying, okay, I got to read the case. Hurry. Okay, now I get 5 minutes to negotiate. Okay, I'll tell my side, and I got to make sure I get the right things. And now I've got to get to the conclusion. And guess what? Our time that we scheduled for our meeting is almost up, and the CEO is going to go, and he's got to go call on a customer. So I don't have much time to talk to him. So I got to learn how to talk really fast, or I've got to have my act together really well. So this is really good practice. I just want you to know that, the fact that you don't get time to do this is perfect. Okay, so what else would I tell you? Beware of anger and negative emotions. You really want to sort of to build that trust, to say, I'm not here just for me. I'm also here to make it a win for you. And that was one of the messages we tried to say to him, right? We want, to that CEO, we want you and this entity to be wildly successful within IBM. And that's our goal. That's what's driving us. We're successful if this acquisition is successful. And so, what are we trying to do there? We're trying to build that self-orientation, right? In his mind, that we're not just in it for us, that he's an important part of it, and that we want that success. Okay, so that was kind of what I was going to talk about tonight. Wanted to leave some time for questions. Any questions you have for me? Other things? Yeah.
I think it was Netflix I was reading about. They made a specific point. They said you don't have to worry about finding another offer and coming back and negotiating for more money. We pay you as much as we can pay you, as the market will allow, so you don't have to worry about leaving money on the table. That's kind of their philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what's your opinion on that? I mean, just the whole idea of negotiating, and it could go all over the place. I mean, care to comment?
So I think that if they go into the negotiation, which it still is, right? If they go into the negotiation with that position, they've basically put the decision in your lap, right? They've said, this is it, take it or leave it. Pretty much, right? And if they're consistent in that approach, that is, if they really do pay everybody according to market, then they've probably built a pretty good business model. My take on that is they're probably not going to get so here's the thing. Anybody taking statistics in here? Have you taken your statistics class yet? What's a normal distribution look like? Bell curve, right? So there's as many people above as there are below. So when you pay to market, you're paying where? Middle of the bell curve, right? So that means if you're paying to market, you're also paying for performance At what level? Middle of the bell curve, right? So you're going to tend toward the average. So if you're okay with that as a company, then I would say that's a great strategy. But you need to think about what the implications of that are for what kind of talent you can attract, right? So if you want superstars, guess what? They're not going to take middle of the bell curve in terms of salary. Because why? Because they're worth more than that in the outside. So I think it's a slippery slope, right? Would that work in other places? Was Saturn successful with their no negotiation car price? You could argue both sides, right? I think for some people they were very successful. I think what happened was GM came in and saw the successful model and went, "Oh, we could make this even better." And then they got unionized, and then they went under, right? So, I mean, I think you sort of have to say, what are the implications of that kind of approach? And you have to think through that. What am I going to get if I get what I ask for? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that was great. That was the side I see all I saw was the positive side of that. I mean, seeing the whole way of thinking that through, and that you're more in the middle ground and there's going to be each side, that was great.
Other questions about negotiation or just about stuff?
I had a question. If I understood you correctly, you're a part of the global acquisition and merging team.
Yep.
What has your experience been trying to develop yourself? Because I imagine IBM, they either merge with companies or acquire companies all over the globe, and so those skills of negotiating with someone in China or India or Mexico, that changes, right? And so how have you developed yourself over your career, or how can we develop ourselves? Because it teaches us in the book that we should develop ourselves so that we can negotiate in different situations. But we live in Logan, Utah, right? And so
right now you live in Logan, Utah.
Right. What have you done, or what do you do, and what can we do to develop ourselves?
So I go back to what I kind of opened with, and that was to say, be open to possibilities. Don't think of your career path as a straight line. I mean, if there's an opportunity to go, one of the things that I sort of wish I had done more of is international assignments. I think that you gain a perspective that you get no other way by living and working in a place different than what you're used to. And I've done that somewhat within the United States. I moved around a bit and worked for different companies. But I think you can do that even more with, one of the things as I look back on my career, I wish I'd done more of is like the international side. I've had worldwide responsibilities a couple of times. When I left IBM, I had worldwide responsibility for software groups, sales, marketing, and sort of their SG&A responsibilities. So I supported those worldwide. Funny story. So you're talking about negotiation and differences in places. So IBM at the time was kind of looking at their sales force, and the fear was that they had a lot of farmers and not very many hunters, if you know that analogy, right? So farmers have a sustained client group that they just kind of take care of them, and they, where hunters go out and they find new business and they're bringing new customers in and they're driving that. And the fear was that they didn't have enough hunters and had too many farmers. So what I did is I put together a survey that was kind of a way of looking at people's personality and teased out of that survey whether or not their personality sort of led them to be more of a hunter in terms of their sales personality or a farmer. And so I was, very happy with myself that I'd come upon this instrument that I was able to use, and I was going to send it out, and I did send it out, and it created quite an uproar in Asia because the feeling was we're not about the individual, we're about us as a group, as a sales team, and how do we go to market, and so it created quite an uproar, and so I ended up having to negotiate with the geo leaders in putting that survey out there and saying we'll look at the results as a whole, right? So wanted to get comfortable with it. What we found actually when we did the survey, so a little side note down this rabbit trail we're going, but a little side note was that they had probably about the right mix of hunters versus farmers, and that they really did need as many farmers as they had because of the number of clients that IBM was servicing and the fact that they were selling new services into those existing businesses. So but it was a very interesting and pretty tense time for a bit. It was one of those bet your career kind of things. Happily, it worked out well, and we got some good results back, and we're able to use that. But yeah, having that ability to sort of negotiate across geographies is key. And there are some things that you'll need to know about. So from a human resources aspect, for example, in Europe, very difficult to lay people off. So when you're doing an acquisition and you're saying, well, in order to run this new business, we'll need about 2/3 of the people that you currently have. That means you've got to figure out a long-term exit strategy, because there's no hi, bye, you're gone kind of thing like we do in the U.S. There are a lot of protections around workers' rights and other things, works councils and other things that are in Europe that are set in place that make it very expensive to lay people off. So, I think it's really important to do that and to kind of move around, and that's one way to do it, is to live in other places, or at least accept assignments that allow you to work internationally.
This is Robert in Salt Lake. Just a question, coming from your background, and I think you started as landscape architecture, is that correct?
Yes.
So starting at that, how did you switch gears? I come from a similar background and going into business. Now, how did you start to switch gears, if you know what I mean? Like, how do you go from doing the one thing, and then how do you get into doing the other, is my question,
Yeah.
I guess.
That's a great question. So, so the first thing you need to be prepared to do is to answer that question in every interview. Like, whatever led you to go from landscape architecture to doing an MBA with an emphasis in organizational behavior? I mean, those seem like very different kinds of things, and they are. And so I would have a standard answer for that, and that was, when I was working for the Forest Service, I got into a management position, and I started reading everything I could find about management. And as I did that, I got more and more interested, and I was so enamored with it that I thought, I should do this for a living. And so then I went back to school and got my degree, and so that's why I'm not a landscape architect anymore. I still have friends that are landscape architects, but I'm not one. So in fact, my old roommate from here, we used to live down here on Darwin Avenue, above the dentist's office. I don't know if the dentist's office is still on Darwin or not. Is it? It is. Okay. So we lived above the dentist's office. You know where that is. And we graduated together, and he's actually the landscape architect for Brigham Young University now. So great guy. Was the best man at my wedding, but I chose a different path. So I think that you just have to have a good story, right? And if you have a good story, and that story makes sense to people that you're interviewing with, and you can be passionate about what you want to do, then I think you can make it work. And you can. One of the things I think was key was being able to use the experiences that I had in my previous work and apply them to what I was trying to do. So in every interview, I would have ways that the strengths that I was trying to convey in my interview I was able to back those strengths up with examples from what I had done previously. So you need to kind of think about that too. It's part of the story, right? You have to have a story about why you're making this change and what you've done can help you in what you want to do. Okay. Other questions?
I'm curious, going back to the story that you were telling us about negotiating with the CEO that you were acquiring. I don't know if they can hear me, because
I'll repeat your question.
Button, but it keeps turning on and off.
I'll repeat your question.
Just hold it down.
I am, as hard as I can.
If
Okay.
someone else is pushing it, it can mess it up.
I think my laptop was sitting on it, sorry.
Oh. So you guys can hear me okay? Okay. No. Anyway, I'm curious about being in a situation where you're negotiating with the CEO, but you also haven't got everything agreed internally about that deal. It feels more like a mediation than it does a negotiation, two-way negotiation. I'm just curious about how they set you up with the liberty that you need to negotiate with the CEO, but then not go back and get in big trouble because you offered too much or something.
Right. So we know going in, this is about know thyself, right? So we know going in kind of what our range is going to be. And we know, because we do a lot of this, kind of what the market is, what we've paid in the past. So what the, not necessarily how much the retention would be, which is what we're negotiating, but how much the total package should be. And so we look at that CEO, for example. Okay, so let me give you a little more detail. In this case, the board had met after the letter of intent had been signed. So the letter of intent basically says, IBM's interested in purchasing you, right? And so the board had gone back after that letter of intent had been and said, oh, if that happens, then we're going to put this change of control language in place in terms of your options, and we're going to accelerate your options, which means they would vest sooner. In other words, they would vest as soon as changing control occurred. So he signs the deal, and now instead of the options that he had totally unvested and the best schedule that those would occur on, because it's usually quarterly or monthly for a few years, 4 years typically, it would now take one of those 4 years and just accelerate the whole year, right? So our holding power now suddenly became less because he had received this extra acceleration from the board. The board's trying to be nice to the CEO, saying you've done a great job, way to go, you got us some money, you got this nice suitor coming in that's going to pay us a lot of money, and all the people on the board are venture capitalists that have invested in this company, right? So they have a lot to gain by this guy doing a successful negotiation with IBM. So they want to say thanks and well done and keep going. So anyway, we kind of know going in, to answer your question, what our range is. We know what we're willing to go up to and what our budget is. And if we have to exceed that, then we also know to say, we really can't do that. Or maybe we'll say, depending on what they're asking for, we need to go back internally to look at that and see if it makes sense from a business case standpoint. Because it's all about a business case. You don't go out and buy things and think, I'm going to buy this because it looks good, right? There's money and projections and pro rata and all of those things sitting on the table that people have looked at and they're exploring in great detail. So we kind of have an idea, and we knew. And by the way, remember what I said about the more I spend for the tier ones, the less I have for the tier twos? Then you just explain that to them too. I mean, you can say that we said that to him. Look, if we go that high for you, that means we're only going to be able to touch 10 of your people. Do you really think that you can come into this business, you're going to lead the unit, and you'll be successful with only being able to retain 10 of your people? Gives you pause, right? And so then you also get a sense of how serious they are about staying, right? Because if they're saying, no, that'll be enough, then you're not serious about staying, right? That means he's going to take the money and run, right? So that also lets you kind of know where they're coming from too. So there's a lot of nuance to this that you need to kind of think about.